Welcome to Valid History. Here, old photos tell real stories from the past. Please subscribe, like, and share to help keep history alive.
In 1912 South Carolina, children as young as 6, Josie, Bertha, and Sophie, began shucking oysters at 4 in the morning, their labor representing the unchecked exploitation of child workers that reformers were only beginning to confront. By 1923, Vladimir Lenin, architect of the Soviet state, sat paralyzed and mute after 3 strokes, attended by his sister and a physician. The revolution's most powerful figure reduced to total silence before his death the following year. In May 1922, 78-year-old Robert Todd Lincoln, the last surviving son of the assassinated president, was helped up the steps at the dedication of the memorial built to honor his father in Washington, D.C. Robert Earl Hughes, born in 1926, reached a recorded weight of 1,071 pounds, making him the heaviest person in documented history, and remarkably, the heaviest human being ever known to walk without assistance before his death in 1958. At their peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fat men's clubs required members to weigh at least 200 pounds, reflecting a distinct social era in the United States when larger body size carried communal pride and organized celebration. Recovered off Israel's northern coast in October 2021, this iron sword, just under 4 feet long, had rested on the seabed for roughly 9 centuries, believed to have belonged to a crusader sailing toward the Holy Land around the year 1100. American pilot Wayne Waddell, shot down over North Vietnam on the 5th of July, 1967, was captured immediately after ejecting, enduring 6 years of imprisonment and torture, before walking free in 1973, when nearly 600 U.S. prisoners were released under the war's peace agreement. Richard Lasher was on his way to ride his dirt bike when Mount St. Helens erupted directly in front of him, a moment of sudden, unimaginable proximity to one of the most violent volcanic events in American recorded history, and he survived. The original 1898 Michelin Man was white because natural rubber tires were gray, white until 1912 when carbon was added not for appearance but for structural durability, a change that also prompted Michelin to begin reviewing restaurants, encouraging longer drives that wore down tires faster. Samuel James Seymour, photographed in 1956 at age 96, was the last living witness to Lincoln's assassination on the 14th of April, 1865, a 5-year-old boy who watched the president slump forward and, not yet understanding, felt concern only for Booth, who had broken his leg in the fall. In 1990, a 106-year-old Armenian woman stood guard outside her home in Dave Village with a rifle as armed conflict raged around nearby Nagorno-Karabakh, a territory whose disputed status between Armenia and Azerbaijan had turned the surrounding region into a war zone. From 1925 until his own death in 1935, Hachik Fei, an Akita dog in Shibuya, Tokyo, returned daily to the train station to wait for his owner, Professor Hadisaber Fei Ueno, who had died of a cerebral hemorrhage and would never again step off the platform. Photographed in 1900, this example of scarification, the practice of permanently marking the skin through cutting, burning, or branding, represented a body modification tradition requiring 6 to 12 months to heal and carrying deep cultural significance across the societies that practiced it. This family photograph from the 1890s captures a moment of ordinary domestic life from a period when photography was becoming accessible enough to preserve the faces of everyday people, not just the powerful, for the generations that would follow. Photographed around 1860, this British veteran of the Napoleonic Wars was still alive, 45 years after the Battle of Waterloo, a living human link to one of the most consequential military conflicts in European history. This 1930 photograph of the British airship R-101 shows passengers boarding via a gangway, offering a rare glimpse into the brief era when lighter, thin-air travel was considered a serious and sophisticated mode of long-distance passenger transport. Photographed in the 1870s, this Chinese woman displays her bound foot, a practice that reshaped the bones of young girls for aesthetic purposes and persisted for roughly 1,000 years before reformers began successfully campaigning for its abolition. Lewis Powell, photographed in wrist irons aboard the USS Saugus in 1865, had been recruited by John Wilkes Booth to assassinate Secretary of State William Seward as part of a coordinated plot, arrested, convicted by military tribunal, and executed at the Washington Arsenal that same year. When parcel post regulations remained vague after 1913, a small number of American families, mostly in rural areas where they knew their mailman personally, briefly exploited postal rules to send children through the mail, with the most widely circulated images staged deliberately as jokes. Photographed during a Russian state visit to the Isle of Wight in August 1909, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and his cousin, the future King George V of Britain, stood together just 5 years before the First World War would draw their nations into a conflict that would ultimately consume them both. Pablo Picasso painted his first self-portrait at 15 in 1896 and his last at 90 in 1972, bookending a career that produced 50,000 works and reshaped the entire language of modern art. A family pauses together in Paris in 1938. Their ordinary moment caught just 1 year before war would permanently alter the world they were living in. In the 1930s, a woman poses surrounded by her many cats, offering an unguarded glimpse into the quiet domestic lives that rarely made it into the historical record. Balanced Rock stands in Colorado Springs Garden of the Gods in the early 20th century. A geological improbability photographed before mass tourism transformed America's natural landmarks into destinations. A 1959 Ford police car sits on duty, representing the era when American automotive design and law enforcement identity became permanently intertwined on the nation's expanding road network. Workers navigate the extraordinary task of relocating an entire house through the streets of San Francisco in 1919, a feat of engineering ambition that the city's dense geography demanded with surprising regularity. Berliners cruised through their city in 1931, 2 years before the political upheaval that would make such ordinary public leisure an artifact of a vanished republic. A camera operator works his equipment on the streets of Chicago in the 1920s, capturing a profession still young enough that the equipment itself drew as much attention as whatever was being filmed. Billie Holiday and Louis Armstrong share a frame in 1949, two of jazz's most commanding voices photographed together at the height of an era that would define American music forever. Albert Einstein, photographed in the 1950s, presents the most recognizable scientific mind of the 20th century in the final decade of a life that had permanently altered humanity's understanding of the universe. A Montreal woman stands proudly beside her washing machine in 1925, a domestic appliance whose arrival represented one of the most significant reductions in household labor in modern history. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward moved through the 1960s as Hollywood's most celebrated real marriage, their public partnership as quietly defiant of the industry's conventions as their separate careers. John Archibald Purves patented the Dynasphere in 1930, a monowheel vehicle from the United Kingdom that promised a revolution in personal transport and delivered instead a footnote in the history of eccentric engineering. Bruce Davidson's 1966 photograph of East 100th Street's facade places the viewer directly inside New York's overlooked neighborhoods, at the precise moment urban decline was becoming impossible to ignore. New York City police halted traffic on a busy street in 1925 to allow a cat and her kitten to cross safely, a moment that somehow survived the century as evidence of unexpected urban tenderness. Ethel Van Zanten places a call from Gateways Drive, up telephone in Portland, Oregon, in 1959, using an infrastructure experiment that anticipated car culture's eventual demand for communication without ever leaving the vehicle. A salesman brings household wares directly to Dutch housewives in Amsterdam in 1953, sustaining a street commerce tradition that post-war Reconstruction and the coming consumer economy would soon make entirely obsolete. Harry Houdini performs one of his celebrated escapes in 1918, the year his act had already made him the most famous entertainer in the world, and the definitive symbol of human will over physical constraint. A housewife in 1947 poses beside a full week's worth of groceries, $12.50 worth of food, enough to feed herself, her husband, her 4-year-old twins, and the family cat. The Peugeot 601C Eclipse of 1934 presented one of automotive design's most technically ambitious experiments, a retractable hardtop roof decades before the mechanism became a standard feature of luxury convertibles. Felix Bonfils photographed visitors gathered at the base of the Great Pyramid in Egypt in the 1870s, producing some of the earliest photographic evidence of Western tourism encountering the ancient world. Tourists pass through a tunnel cut directly into the living trunk of the Wawona tree in Yosemite, California, in the 1920s, experiencing a spectacle that prioritized human wonder over the ancient sequoia's long-term survival. Russell Lee photographed Mrs. Orville White making pancakes near Northome, Minnesota, in 1937, documenting with quiet precision the domestic rhythms of rural American life that New Deal photography set out to preserve. A farm family sits down to supper in Claiborne County, Tennessee. In 1940, their meal and their table, a quiet record of rural life documented in the same years that federal agencies were debating its future. An iceman delivers a 25-pound block of ice to a Houston, Texas household in 1928, practicing a trade that refrigeration technology was already beginning to eliminate city by city across America. A woman sits in a beauty parlor in the 1920s, participating in an industry that the decade's social transformation had elevated from private luxury to a mainstream institution of modern femininity. Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin are photographed together in 1952, two architects of silent comedy reunited decades after the medium that made them famous had been entirely displaced by the talkies. Woodcutters work among the towering redwoods of Northern California in 1915, their labor extracting timber from forests that conservationists and the logging industry were already in direct conflict over preserving or consuming. A Native American man surveys the newly completed Transcontinental Railroad in Nevada in 1869, standing at the precise intersection of the nation's technological triumph and the displacement that made that triumph possible. Alfred Eisenstadt photographed a young couple sharing lunch on the right bank of the Seine below Notre Dame in Paris in 1963, a scene of unremarkable happiness made permanent by one of the 20th century's great photographers. San Francisco in 1906 stands at the edge of the earthquake and fire that would within days destroy much of what any photograph taken that year was still able to show. Veterinary surgeon E. Rubush treats an injured dog owned by Albert Edward Holland in Washington, D.C. around 1925, in a photograph that places professional animal care within reach of at least some urban pet owners of that era. Native Americans from southeast Idaho are photographed around 1897, their image captured at a moment when federal policy and westward settlement were combining to permanently alter the way of life the photograph itself records. Two women hail a Vespa taxi scooter in Milan in 1952, using an improvised transport solution that captured exactly how Italian cities were rebuilding mobility, ingenuity, and daily life from the wreckage of the war. A tea service is laid out and observed with careful social formality in the 1880s, the ritual at its cultural peak as a marker of British bourgeois identity both at home and across the empire. Claire Windsor, photographed in the 1920s, was an American actress whose career flourished during the silent film era before the arrival of sound permanently restructured Hollywood's relationship with the faces it had made famous. A vintage bicycle from the early 1900s stands as a record of personal transportation at the moment, when the automobile had not yet displaced the machine that had given an earlier generation its first taste of independent movement. Atlantic City in 1912 presents its boardwalk and shoreline at the height of its first golden era, before 2 world wars and a century of changing leisure habits transformed what the resort meant to the American public. A visitor examines the cast, iron book alcoves lining the main reading hall of the Cincinnati Public Library around 1900, inside a building whose architectural ambition treated public literacy as a monument worthy of civic grandeur. A workman stands on a gantry high above Tower Bridge, London, in 1913, his elevated position above the Thames offering a perspective on the city that almost no one who lived and worked below him would ever see. The 1922 Audi Type K represents the German manufacturer in its earliest years, producing automobiles at a moment when European engineering ambition and post-war economic reality were still negotiating the terms of what luxury motoring could mean. Pasquale Tarrafo plays his harp guitar in 1910, a virtuoso performer on an instrument that occupied a brief and extraordinary place in early 20th century music before disappearing almost entirely from popular performance. A Southern Pacific steam engine works the oil fields near Bakersfield, California in 1908, the railroad and the petroleum industry sharing the same landscape at the precise moment both were transforming the American West simultaneously. 2 men stand beside a Coca-Cola delivery truck around 1910, at the start of a distribution network that would spend the next century making the brand's presence visible in nearly every corner of the world. A postcard seller works the streets of Paris in 1911, trading in the era's dominant form of visual communication at a moment when the postcard industry was producing billions of images annually across Europe alone. Alfred Hitchcock serves Grace Kelly tea on the set of To Catch a Thief in the 1950s, a behind-the-scenes gesture between director and star that speaks to the particular collaborative intimacy of Hollywood's studio era. Steven Spielberg works with a miniature battle sequence for Raiders of the Lost Ark, the practical effects technique that allowed his generation of filmmakers to construct visual spectacle before digital production made such craft largely obsolete. IBM's 5-megabyte hard drive is moved by workers in 1956, the machine's size and the effort required to transport it a precise measure of how distant that moment was from the storage devices that would follow. A woman carries her umbrella in a composed portrait from around 1900, a small record of the fashionable self-presentation that photography was just beginning to make available to people well outside the traditional portrait painting classes. The Jersey Shore is photographed around 1908, its beach and visitors captured before the resort infrastructure, the traffic, and the scale of 20th century leisure permanently changed what a summer day at the shore could look like. Buffalo soldiers patrol Yellowstone National Park by bicycle in 1896, African American troops performing conservation duty at a national landmark, while the racial segregation structuring their military service went entirely unquestioned by the nation they served. NASA engineer Alan Hazard tests the Lunar Exploration Space Suit Mark I, a prototype of his own design representing the iterative hands on engineering culture that was quietly building the technical foundation for the moon landings. The Flatiron Building rises above Madison Square in New York in 1916, already one of the city's most distinctive landmarks and proof that the architectural ambition of the previous decade had permanently altered the Manhattan skyline. 6-year-old Werfel, living in an Austrian orphanage in 1946, hugs a new pair of shoes provided by the American Red Cross. Gerald Waller's photograph reducing the entire scale of post-war European devastation to a single child's relief. Charlie Chaplin and Anna Pavlova are photographed together in 1922. Two of their respective art forms' supreme practitioners meeting at the moment. Both silent film and classical ballet were reaching the height of their global audiences. Berlin's Central Plaza is photographed from above in the 1920s. The city's confidence and scale on full display during the Weimar Republic's brief window of cultural flourishing before the decade's end brought everything crashing down. A family poses formally for their photograph in 1873. Their stillness and careful arrangement a record of just how demanding early photographic technology made the simple act of preserving a family's image for the future. A cook peels onions while wearing a gas mask in 1918, a practical solution born directly from a war that had introduced chemical weapons into the world and made the mask a household object of the era. A woman stands beside a massive cedar tree in Stanley Park, Vancouver, in 1897, the old-growth forest behind her still largely intact at the moment. The city surrounding it was just beginning to define its own boundaries. Customers drink at a portable milk bar installed at London's Waterloo Station on the 1st of June 1937, a public health initiative dressed as convenience, bringing pasteurized dairy to commuters, moving through one of the city's busiest terminals. Venice's Grand Canal is drained and cleaned in 1956, exposing the ancient waterway's bed and the centuries of sediment beneath the surface of a city whose infrastructure maintenance usually remained invisible to its millions of visitors. Robert Wadlow, known as the Alton Giant, stands at 8 feet 11 inches, the tallest person in recorded human history, his height documented with clinical precision throughout a short life that ended at just 22 years of age. A father and young child navigate Amsterdam together in 1972. Tony Riera's photograph placing the counterculture's domestic reality in the context of a city that had become one of the movement's most visible and tolerant European homes. Frank Sinatra and heavyweight champion Rocky Marciano are photographed together in 1955, two of their respective fields' most dominant figures meeting at the precise moment both were at the peak of their public fame. A Victorian exercise machine stands as evidence of the era's particular anxiety about physical health, producing apparatus whose mechanical ingenuity was matched only by its distance from any understanding of how the human body actually functions. A day on the river in 1941 is photographed with the unhurried quality of leisure, enjoyed just as the world outside was accelerating toward a conflict that would make such stillness seem almost deliberately preserved. Skateboarders take to the streets of New York City in 1965, early practitioners of a sport still informal enough to belong entirely to the sidewalks before the industry. The competitions and the culture caught up with them. A Ford Model T converted into a streetlight maintenance truck serves New York in 1926. The vehicle's adaptability to industrial purposes a testament to the engineering pragmatism that made it the defining machine of its era. A vintage motorcycle from around 1916 stands as a record of personal transportation at the moment, when two-wheeled engineering was advancing fast enough to serve both military and civilian needs simultaneously during the First World War. Leonard Nimoy sits for his Spock haircut in the 1960s, the precise physical transformation that would make his face one of television's most recognized silhouettes, and the character he was becoming one of science fiction's most enduring creations. A compact and peculiar automobile navigates London's streets in 1963, the city's congested roads producing a market for minimal, unconventional vehicles that the decade's designers were competing with notable creative enthusiasm to satisfy. A water cellar works the streets of Naples, Italy in 1890, providing a service that urban infrastructure had not yet made obsolete, in a city where the distance between ancient custom and modern life was measured in very short blocks. Two young women play billiards together around 1903, their presence at a table associated almost exclusively with men, a quiet signal of the expanding social spaces that women of a certain class were beginning to claim as their own. The New York Public Library's book wagon carries reading material through the city in the 1930s, bringing the library's resources directly to neighborhoods at the height of a depression during which access to books was among the smaller but genuine hardships. A milkmaid and farmhand are photographed together in Whitby, North Yorkshire. In the late 1800s, their working relationship and the landscape behind them, unchanged in its essentials from agricultural practices centuries older than their own lifetimes. Dundee, Scotland is photographed in 1944. The city's wartime appearance a record of the particular combination of industrial endurance and civilian sacrifice that defined British urban life during the final years of the Second World War. A Walgreens employee tends to customers in a Boise, Idaho location in 1958. The drugstore's organized aisles and careful service, a snapshot of American retail at the height of the post-war consumer economy's confident expansion. Paris in the early 1900s presents its streets and inhabitants. At the moment, the city was simultaneously the world's cultural capital and the site of the urban transformation that Haussmann's plans had set irrevocably in motion. A shoemaker works at his bench in the late 19th century, practicing a craft that industrialization was already beginning to pressure but had not yet displaced. The handmade shoe still the standard for anyone who could afford the time it required. London in 1926 is photographed during a year defined by the general strike, when the city's working life ground to a halt for 9 days in a confrontation between labor and government that neither side fully won. A Nash Rambler convertible is photographed in 1950, the American Motors vehicle representing the compact car segment in an era when Detroit was still producing cars of extravagant size. The Rambler, a quiet dissent from the dominant philosophy of the post-war automobile industry. American sport photographers are captured at work in the 1910s, their bulky equipment and formal positioning a document of how the profession looked before telephoto lenses and motor drives transformed sports photography into something faster, closer, and far more intimate. A teenage Tupac Shakur is photographed backstage at the American Music Awards in Los Angeles in 1989, getting an autograph from Flavor Flav, two figures caught in the same frame years before either had reached the height of an influence that would outlast the decade. Lonnie Johnson is photographed in 1992 with the Super Soaker, the water gun he invented using engineering expertise, developed during his career at NASA, the toy already well on its way to becoming one of the best-selling playthings in American retail history. Lisbon is photographed in 1912, the Portuguese capital captured in the early years of the Republic that had replaced the monarchy just 2 years earlier. The city's streets and architecture holding the composed, unhurried quality of a city that had endured for centuries. A Ford Model T drives up the steps of the Tennessee State Capitol in 1911, a publicity stunt that made a mechanical argument for automotive capability in the same decade when the car was still proving itself to a skeptical public. Albert Einstein is photographed as a professor in 1931. The physicist documented in his academic role during the years when his work had already reshaped the theoretical foundations of physics, and his name had become synonymous with scientific genius worldwide. A young Berber girl is photographed in ethnic attire around 1908, her portrait made during the final years of a century that saw European colonial powers consolidate their presence across North Africa, the image carrying the weight of that context in every detail. New York City is photographed in 1974, the image capturing the urban texture of a metropolis in the middle of a fiscal and social crisis that would define the decade and test the city's capacity for reinvention over the years that followed. A teenage Bill Clinton shakes President John F. Kennedy's hand in Washington, D.C. in 1963, a photograph made months before the assassination. The future president's face already turned toward the man whose legacy would cast a long shadow over the Democratic Party for generations.